It was March 14th, 1974, 11:52 p.m., NBC Studios, Burbank, California. The studio audience had been waiting for this moment for weeks. Muhammad Ali, the most famous man on the planet, was about to sit down with Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. Tickets to this taping had been traded like currency in Hollywood. People had called in favors, shown up at NBC's doors at 4 a.m. just to be in that room. Because everyone knew that when Muhammad Ali walked into a space, something happened. The air changed, the temperature shifted, the world leaned in. Johnny Carson was standing behind his desk, notes in hand, smiling at his producer. He had interviewed presidents. He had sat across from Marlon Brando, Frank Sinatra, Bob Hope. He had kept his composure through every kind of surprise this business could throw at him. But even Johnny, even the unshakable king of late night, felt something different about tonight, a low hum in his chest, something between excitement and warning. Ed McMahon leaned over from his chair. "Johnny, you ready for this one?" Johnny smiled. "Ed, I've never been ready for Muhammad Ali. Nobody has." The audience laughed. The cameras were rolling. Everything was in place. The band was warm. The lights were bright. And backstage, Muhammad Ali was standing completely still in the hallway, eyes closed, lips moving slightly, as if he was having a conversation with someone no one else could see. His manager, Herbert Muhammad, touched his arm. "Champ, 2 minutes." Ali opened his eyes. He looked at Herbert for a long moment. Then he said something so quietly that Herbert would spend years wondering if he'd heard it correctly. He said, "Tonight is not about boxing." Herbert frowned. "Champ, what does that mean?" But Ali had already started walking toward the stage entrance. His footsteps were unhurried, deliberate, like a man who knew exactly where he was going and exactly why. Nobody in that studio knew what was about to happen. Not Johnny. Not Ed. Not the 340 people filling every seat in Studio One. Not the 31 million Americans who would watch this broadcast from their living rooms. Nobody knew that Muhammad Ali had made a decision 3 days earlier that would change the entire night. A decision rooted in something that had nothing to do with boxing, nothing to do with fame, nothing to do with the performance everyone was expecting. A decision that would make Johnny Carson stop mid-sentence, that would make a studio full of people fall completely silent, that would make grown men and women weep openly in their seats, and that would never be fully explained to the public for nearly a decade. Coming up, the real reason Muhammad Ali refused to shake Johnny Carson's hand. The private conversation that happened in a Chicago hospital room 5 days earlier. And the 7 words Ali whispered into the microphone that made the entire audience forget they were on television. But before we get into what happened that night, I see messages all the time in the comment section that some of you didn't realize you hadn't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something that anybody who watches this show can do to help us keep everything going. You are part of this journey, and I appreciate you more than you know. Now, let's go back to March 1974. Because to understand what happened that night on The Tonight Show stage, you have to understand what had happened to Muhammad Ali in the 5 days before he ever set foot in that studio. It was March 9th, 1974, Chicago. Ali was in the city for a series of appearances and training sessions ahead of his upcoming fight. He was staying at a hotel on Michigan Avenue, sleeping 4 hours a night, running before dawn, shadowboxing in his room until the walls shook. This was Muhammad Ali in full force, unstoppable, immovable, the greatest. But on the afternoon of March 9th, Ali received a phone call that stopped him cold. The call came from a woman named Clara Mae Washington. She was 67 years old. She lived in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago, and she was dying. Clara Mae was not famous. She had no connection to the boxing world. She had never been on television. She had never been mentioned in a newspaper. She was a retired seamstress who had spent 40 years making other people's clothes and raising other people's children as a foster mother. She had taken in 14 children over the course of her life, fed them, clothed them, held them when they cried, pushed them when they needed pushing, and loved them when nobody else would. One of those children was a boy named Raymond. Raymond had come to Clara Mae at age 7, malnourished, frightened, unable to look adults in the eye. Clara Mae had taken his face in her hands on the first night and said, "You are safe here. You are loved here." And she had meant it every single day for the next 11 years. Raymond was now 29 years old. He worked at a community center on the west side of Chicago, teaching young men how to box. He had never become a professional fighter, but he had become something rarer. He had become the kind of man who shows up, the kind of man who remembers what it felt like to be invisible and makes sure no child in his orbit ever feels that way. Raymond had met Muhammad Ali 3 years earlier at a charity event. Ali had watched Raymond work with the kids at the community center and had been struck by something he couldn't immediately name. This young man moved through that gym the same way Ali moved through the world, with complete presence, with absolute attention to whoever was in front of him. Ali had pulled Raymond aside that day and said, "I want to know your story." And Raymond had told him. All of it, including Clara Mae. After that, Ali had called Clara Mae directly, just to say thank you, just to tell her that whatever she had done to raise a man like Raymond, she had done something that mattered. Clara Mae had laughed on the phone and said, "Baby, I didn't do nothing special. I just showed up." Ali had never forgotten those words. I just showed up. Now, 3 years later, Clara Mae Washington was in a hospital bed with congestive heart failure. Her doctors had told her family she had weeks, possibly days. She was conscious, but fading. And she had one request. She wanted to meet Muhammad Ali. Raymond had called Ali's manager, apologizing, explaining, saying he knew it was a lot to ask. Ali had listened to the whole message, then picked up the phone and called Raymond back within the hour. "What hospital?" Ali asked. Raymond told him. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," Ali said. He showed up at 7 a.m. with no entourage, no cameras, no press. Just Muhammad Ali in a plain tracksuit walking through the corridors of a Chicago hospital, carrying a small bunch of yellow flowers he'd bought from a cart outside. Clara Mae was propped up in her bed when he walked in. Her eyes were tired but sharp. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled and said, "Well, you're taller on television." Ali laughed, the real laugh, the one that started in his belly and took over his whole face. He pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down, not the way famous people sit when they're being gracious. He sat like a man who had nowhere else to be. They talked for 2 hours. Ali held her hand and asked her about her life, about the children she had raised, about the early years when money was so tight she had mended her own shoes with cardboard, about the church choir she had sung in for 30 years, about her late husband James, who had died of a stroke in 1968 and whom she still talked to every morning when she woke up. Clara Mae asked Ali about his faith, about what it felt like to stand in the center of a boxing ring with the whole world watching, about whether he ever got scared. Ali looked at her for a moment. Then he said yes, every time. Clara Mae nodded like that was the right answer. She said, "The ones who say they're never scared are the ones not paying attention." At the end of the visit, as Ali was standing to leave, Clara Mae reached up and took his face in her hands. The same gesture she had used with every frightened child who had ever come through her door. She said, "Baby, you have a gift, not just the fighting, the way you make people feel seen. Don't ever waste that." Ali stood there, this enormous man, this force of nature, standing completely still while a dying woman held his face. His eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide it. "I won't," he said. She let him go. He walked out of the room, down the hallway, out of the hospital, and sat in the car without speaking for a very long time. Clara Mae Washington died on March 12, 1974, 2 days before the Tonight Show taping. Ali found out in the morning. He was in the middle of a training run. He stopped in the middle of the street, just stopped, stood there breathing, the way men stand when they're trying to hold something together that wants to fall apart. Raymond called him that evening. They talked for a while. Ali told Raymond about what Clara Mae had said, about not wasting the gift, about making people feel seen. Raymond was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She said something similar to me once. She said the best thing you can do with your life is pay attention to the people in front of you. Really pay attention. Like they're the only person in the world." Ali was silent. Raymond said, "She would have loved watching you on the Carson show tomorrow." Ali said, "Then I'll make sure she does." Raymond didn't know what that meant. Ali hung up the phone, and for the next several hours he sat alone in his hotel room thinking about Clara Mae Washington, about Raymond, about every person who had ever sat in front of him and felt seen, and about the ones who never had. By midnight, he had made a decision. March 14th, 1974. Back in Studio One, Ed McMahon's voice filled the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, the heavyweight champion of the world, Muhammad Ali." The audience erupted. It was not polite applause. It was the sound of 340 people releasing something. Standing, clapping, cheering, some of them actually crying already just from the sight of him. Muhammad Ali walked through the curtain and into the light. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, moving with that unhurried grace that somehow looked like both total relaxation and coiled power at the same time. He smiled at the audience. That smile, the one that had been on magazine covers, on posters, on the walls of gymnasiums from Chicago to Casablanca. He moved toward Johnny's desk. Johnny was standing, hand extended, smiling. The handshake was supposed to be the first beat of the segment, a simple gesture, the kind of thing that happened 1,000 times on late-night television. Guest arrives, host extends hand, handshake, sit down, begin. Ali stopped. He looked at Johnny's extended hand. Then he looked at Johnny's face. Then he looked out at the audience. And then, very deliberately, very slowly, he turned away from Johnny's hand and walked to the front of the desk. He stood in front of it, not behind it, facing the audience directly. The studio went instantly silent. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for a punchline. The deep silence of people who have just witnessed something they don't yet understand. Johnny's hand was still partially extended. His smile was still in place, but different now, confused. Professional composure covering genuine surprise. Ali stood at the front of that stage for what witnesses later described as somewhere between 15 and 30 seconds, just standing, looking out at the faces in front of him, moving his gaze slowly, row by row, like he was actually looking at each person, taking them in, seeing them. No one spoke. No one coughed. The cameras kept rolling. Then Ali turned around. He walked back to Johnny, and instead of shaking his hand, he embraced him. Not a performance hug, a real one. Both arms, pulling Johnny in, holding him for a full 3 seconds before releasing him. Johnny Carson, who had maintained his composure through 16 years of live television, who had smiled through disasters and surprises and awkward moments beyond counting, looked genuinely shaken. His eyes were bright. He laughed, a slightly unsteady sound, and said, "Well, I was not expecting that." They sat down. The audience was still not quite back to normal. Something had shifted in the room. The air was different, charged. Johnny leaned forward. "Muhammad, I have to ask, what was that? What just happened up here?" Ali leaned back in his chair. He was in no hurry. He looked at Johnny the way Clara Mae had looked at him, with complete attention. He said, "I was thinking about someone." Johnny nodded slowly. "Someone important?" Ali said, "The most important person you never heard of." He paused. Let the silence sit for a moment. "Her name was Clara Mae Washington," Ali said. "She died 2 days ago. She was 67 years old. She was a seamstress. She raised 14 children that weren't hers because nobody else was going to. She never made $1 from it. She never got famous for it. She just showed up. Every single day for 40 years, she just showed up for people who needed her." The studio was completely still. Johnny had stopped smiling. He was listening the way good interviewers listen, with his whole body. "I visited her in the hospital 5 days ago," Ali continued. "She was dying, and she wanted to meet me. And I thought I was going there to do something for her. You know how that is. Famous person visits sick person. Big gesture. I thought I was going there to give something." He shook his head slowly. "But she gave everything to me. She held my face in her hands, and she told me not to waste the gift. She said the gift wasn't the boxing. She said the gift was making people feel seen. And I've been thinking about that for 5 days. I've been thinking about how many times I've walked into a room and let people watch me instead of looking back at them. How many hands I've shaken without really seeing the person attached to the hand." His voice was quiet now. Still strong, but quiet. The performance was completely gone. This was just a man talking. "So when I walked out here tonight," he said, "I didn't want to shake your hand, Johnny. Not because I don't respect you. I respect you more than most people in this business, but because shaking hands is something you do to move past a person. And I didn't want to move past anybody tonight. I wanted to stop. I wanted to look, the way Clara Mae looked at people, like they were worth stopping for. In the third row, a woman pressed both hands over her mouth. Tears were streaming down her face. In the fifth row, a man who had come to the taping with his adult son reached over and gripped his son's arm without looking at him. His son looked at his father's hand on his arm. Then he put his own hand over his father's. Across 31 million living rooms in America, people were setting down their newspapers, their cups of coffee, their crossword puzzles, leaning toward their televisions, feeling something they couldn't quite name but recognized somewhere deep and old inside themselves. Johnny Carson said, "Tell me about her. Tell me about Clara Mae." And Muhammad Ali did. He talked for 22 minutes without stopping. He talked about Raymond and the community center and the first time he'd watched a young man teach frightened boys how to carry themselves with dignity. He talked about calling Clara Mae to say thank you, and her laughing and saying she hadn't done anything special. He talked about the hospital room and the yellow flowers and sitting beside her bed while she told him about James and the choir and the cardboard shoes. He talked about what she had asked him, whether he ever got scared, and what it had meant to finally say yes to someone who already knew the answer and loved him for it anyway. He talked about standing in the street during his morning run when he found out she had died, about how he stood there trying to hold himself together and realizing that the reason it hurt so much was because she had seen him. Really seen him. Not Muhammad Ali the champion, not the greatest, not the magazine cover, just a man. And she had held that man's face in her hands and told him he was worth something beyond what he could do in a ring. At some point during the 22 minutes, Ed McMahon quietly reached up and covered his eyes. He sat that way for a long time. At some point, one of the camera operators, a man named Gerald Torres who had worked at NBC for 11 years and had seen everything, turned away from his camera for 10 seconds. Just 10 seconds. Then he turned back and kept shooting. At some point, Johnny Carson stopped taking notes entirely. He just sat there, leaning forward, elbows on the desk, looking at Muhammad Ali the way you look at something rare, something you know you will never see again. When Ali finished, the studio was quiet for a long moment. Then Johnny said something he had never said to a guest in 16 years of The Tonight Show. He said, "I don't have any questions. I just want to say thank you." Ali looked at him, a long, steady look. Then he said, "That's what she would have wanted to hear." The applause that followed was not the explosion that usually greeted big moments on The Tonight Show. It built slowly, the way a tide comes in. One person starting, then another, then the whole room standing, not in the frantic way audiences stand when they've been told to react, but in the quiet, unanimous way people stand when they've witnessed something real and don't know what else to do with what they're feeling. Johnny stood too. He walked around the desk, the way he almost never did during the show, and stood next to Ali, not shaking his hand, not performing anything, just standing next to him while the audience gave their long, slow, genuine applause to a woman named Clara Mae Washington, who had never been on television and never would be. After the show, in the hallway outside Studio One, a young production assistant named Diane Ferris found Muhammad Ali standing by himself. Everyone else had moved on, the crew, the other guests, the NBC executives. Ali was just standing there looking at nothing in particular. Diane was 23 years old. It was her third month working at NBC. She had no reason to speak to Muhammad Ali. Every professional instinct she had told her to walk past, not to intrude, not to bother the most famous man in the world, who was clearly in the middle of something private. She stopped anyway. She said, "Mr. Ali, I lost my grandmother last year. She raised me. And everything you said in there tonight was everything I've been trying to say out loud for 12 months and couldn't find the words for." Ali looked at her, that same complete attention, like she was the only person in the building. He said, "What was her name?" Diane blinked. She wasn't expecting that question. She said, Evelyn Ferris." Ali nodded slowly. He said, "Evelyn Ferris was worth stopping for." Diane Ferris, who would go on to produce television, for the next 30 years, would tell that story at every significant moment in her career. At her first major production wrap, at her retirement party, at her daughter's wedding, she would always say the same thing. The most famous man in the world stopped in a hallway and said my grandmother's name like it mattered. And that changed the way I did everything after that. Muhammad Ali won the heavyweight championship of the world again 7 months later, in October 1974, against George Foreman in Kinshasa, Zaire. The Rumble in the Jungle, one of the greatest sporting events in human history. The whole world was watching. But the people who had been in Studio One on March 14, 1974, the ones who had been in those seats when Ali stood at the front of the stage and looked at them, row by row, like they were worth stopping for, those people would tell you a different story about what Muhammad Ali's greatest performance was. It was not in a boxing ring. It was on a talk show stage, on a Thursday night in March, when the most famous man in the world decided not to shake anybody's hand and instead chose to stop, to look, to say the name of a woman nobody had ever heard of, to remind 31 million people watching from their living rooms that the greatest thing any human being can do is make another person feel seen. Clara Mae Washington never knew her name would be spoken on national television. She never knew that Muhammad Ali would carry her words onto the most watched late-night show in America. She never knew that a seamstress from the south side of Chicago who just showed up would become, for one Thursday night in March 1974, someone the whole country stopped to think about. She just showed up, every day, for 40 years, and it turned out that was everything. Johnny Carson referenced that night many times in the years that followed. In interviews, in private conversations, in the occasional moment during the show when something would remind him of it, he always said the same thing. He said Muhammad Ali came in that night to do something I didn't know television could do. He came in to make people feel less alone. Raymond kept running the community center on the west side of Chicago. He named the boxing gym after Clara Mae, the Clara Mae Washington Youth Center. It's still there, and every year on March 14th, on the anniversary of that Tonight Show taping, Raymond does something he started the year after Clara Mae died. He shows up at the center before anyone else arrives. He unlocks the door, he turns on the lights, he sets up the equipment, he does all the things that need doing before the day begins, and he does it without telling anyone why that date matters. He just shows up, the way she taught him. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the people who change us most are often the ones nobody writes about, share it. Share it with someone who is grieving a person the world didn't notice. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that showing up, really showing up, is not a small thing. It is everything. And subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the moments when the most famous people in the world stopped performing and started being human. Because somewhere right now, there is a Clara Mae Washington in someone's life. Someone who just shows up, someone who holds faces in their hands and means it, someone who will never be on television, someone who deserves to be seen. See them. That's what Muhammad Ali did on a Thursday night in March 1974. That's what changed everything. That's what still matters today.